Adam and host Cartwright were brothers on Bonanza, but they couldn't have been more different. Adam was a smart, educated architect, and Host was a kind, gentle giant behind the scenes. Their actors, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker, were also very different. Pernell was known for criticizing the show openly and often got into fights with its creators and co-stars. Dan, on the other hand, loved playing Host but hated the fame it brought and sought solace far away from Hollywood. Their paths split even more dramatically after Blocker died suddenly at the age of 43. While fans were sad, Roberts made an unusual choice. He didn't go to the funeral. Was he staying away out of anger or something deeper? Before Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker became famous on Bonanza, their lives were full of twists and turns that made them into the stars we know today. It's amazing to think about how different their early years were and how fate brought them together on one of the most famous TV shows of all time, Let Me Take You Back. Pernell Roberts, who would become Adam Cartwright, had a deep love for the stage. He made his first big splash in 1949 when he stepped onto the stage at the only theater in Maryland and acted with Moss Hart, Kitty Carlisle, and The Man Who Came to Dinner. It was just the beginning, but he was already showing promise. From that point on, Pernell didn't stop. He played many roles, such as Dan in Night Must Fall and Alfred Little in Pigman. The guy wasn't just talented, he was also very flexible. You could tell he was meant for something big by 1952, when Pernell was ready to go after even bigger dreams. He packed his bags and headed to New York City, which at the time was the place to be for anyone who wanted to make it in theater. And Pernell didn't waste any time getting involved. He worked off-Broadway in one-act operas and Shakespearean plays. Imagine him as Mario in Romeo and Juliet, or walking across the stage as MC Beth, and won a Drama Desk Award in 1955 for that performance, which was no small feat. Although the American Shakespeare Festival really cemented his love for classical roles, he wasn't afraid to try new things. He was in everything from Twelfth Night to The Merchant of Venice, always adding his own style to the roles. As it often does, television came calling, and Pernell made his debut in 1956 on Craft, a TV theater show. If you were watching at the time, you might have seen him in shows like Whirlybirds or Cheyenne. You might not be familiar with today's author of childhood friends, Anthony Moreno, the late Anthony Moreno. But the stage was still where his heart was, even when he got a contract to work in movies. In 1957, he signed with Columbia Pictures and kept juggling acting, TV, and movies. One of his first movie roles was as one of Burroughs' sons in Desire Under the Elm, 1958. Pernell was good at playing complex, intense characters, and that caught people's attention. Around the same time, Dan Blocker was finding his own way. Dan's path to fame wasn't as direct as Pernell's. He was a big guy who was hard to miss, but he had a gentle soul before Hollywood. During the Korean War, Dan joined the army and worked as an infantry sergeant. It must not have been easy for him. He saw combat and even earned a Purple Heart for his bravery, but those experiences must have made him the strong and kind person he became as host Cartwright. After the war, Dan went back to normal life and started acting. In 1957, he was in a Three Stooges short film called Outer Space Jitters. It's funny to think of him in that role, but Dan had a great sense of humor. He had a sense of humor and wasn't afraid to play odd roles. He showed up in episodes of Gunsmoke, Cheyenne, and even The Rifleman. One of his most memorable early roles was as a rodeo performer in Richard Diamond's Private Detective. He played all kinds of characters like blacksmiths, bartenders, and cattlemen, and slowly built a reputation as a reliable character actor. Meanwhile, Pernell and Dan were unknowingly heading toward each other. By the late 1950s, Pernell had become a respected actor who jumped between Broadway roles, guest appearances on TV and supporting roles in movies. Dan, on the other hand, was making a name for himself in westerns. He had a roughness that fit the genre perfectly, but he also had a warmth that made him stand out. In 1959, both men had big moments in their careers that would soon lead them to the same place. Pernell played a complicated outlaw opposite Randolph Scott in the movie Ride Lonesome. Critics loved it and called it one of the best roles of his career. While this was going on, Dan had a small part in the pilot episode of The Rebel as a troubled rancher. It wasn't a big role, but it showed how he could make tough, larger-than-life characters seem vulnerable. Then there was Bonanza. The show's creator, David Dortort, was casting a family drama set in the Wild West. He wanted actors who could bring something unique to the Cartwright family and strong personalities that would make each person stand out. Pernell, who had been on stage before and had a commanding presence, was a natural choice to play Adam, the oldest son of the Cartwright. He had an air of authority and a quiet intensity that made you think he could hold his own on a huge ranch. Dan, on the other hand, was cast as Hos, the gentle giant with a heart of gold. Dartorit saw something special in Dan that went beyond his size. Hos had to be likable and someone people would root for, and Dan was the perfect choice. For the part, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker, two men from very different backgrounds, were about to make television history when they walked onto the set of Bonanza. Little did they know that their lives and careers would change forever. When Bonanza first aired in 1959, it was clear that it wasn't your average Western. It wasn't just about gunfights, outlaws, and dusty saloons. It was also about family values and standing up for what's right, set against the unexpected to give strength and hope to the lonely fallen alike. The show was set in the beautiful Nevada wilderness, and the Cartwright family, who were more than just ranchers, were role models of strength, kindness, and doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker became important parts of that family dynamic, but their time on the show wasn't always easy. Carell played Adam Cartwright, the oldest son. Adam was different from his brothers because he was smart, educated, and full of ideas as an architectural engineer. Many times, Pernell played Adam with the right amount of seriousness. But as the show went on, Pernell started to feel limited by the character and the show itself. He was used to working in theater, where every role was new and exciting, and playing Adam week after week in the same costume and setting didn't feel satisfying to him. Pernell wasn't afraid to voice his frustrations. He often called the show junk television and criticized its lack of depth. He even joked that being on Bonanza was like Isaac Stern sitting in with Lawrence Welk. That's how much he didn't like being a part of something he thought was below his potential. But Pernell's biggest problem wasn't just with the scripts. He also hated how his character, a grown man in his 30s named Ben Cartwright, played by Lauren Green, always had to ask his father for permission to do things in interviews. He called the relationship obnoxious. It didn't make sense for three grown men to depend on their dad for everything, and he didn't feel like his role was growing, which made him unhappy. He wanted stories with more meaning, more challenges, and more chances to show off his acting skills. While Pernell had trouble with Nan's direction, Dan Blocker embraced his role as Hoss Cartwright. Hoss was the heart of the show, a big lovable guy with a good heart, and Dan brought so much warmth and humor to the role that it's hard to imagine anyone else playing the part. It worked great that Dan based his character on a childhood friend who was tough on the outside but soft on the inside. He also brought his own philosophy to the role. He once said that he played Hos with the quote, "We shall pass this way on earth but once. If there is any kindness we can show, let us do it now," in mind. That kindness came through in every scene. Hos was the one who helped strangers, stood up for the underdog, and showed the softer side of the political world. Fans loved him for it, and so did his co-stars. But things weren't always that way. Pernell and Dan were filming an episode called The Dowry in 1962 when they were riding horses downhill on a muddy path when Pernell's horse stuttered and fell. Dan, who was close behind, couldn't avoid the mess and also fell. Both men tried to jump clear, but they were hurt. Dan broke his collarbone and separated his shoulder, and the crew had to change the scripts so Dan could keep filming with his arm in a sling. Not only hurt Pernell physically, but it also seemed like another reason for him to want to leave the show. He was already unhappy, and now he had to deal with an injury on top of that. Some critics even said that the accident was the last straw for him. Even though he stayed on Bonanza for a few more seasons, it was clear that his heart wasn't in it anymore. Behind the scenes, the cast had a complicated dynamic. Pernell's outspokenness often put him at odds with the producers and writers. He was never afraid to voice his opinions, even if it meant Dan was more laid back and got along with everyone. His sense of humor and big personality made him a fan favorite on set. Despite their differences, the two actors respected each other. They weren't best friends, but they worked well together and brought their characters to life in a way that audiences could relate to. As Pernell's dissatisfaction with the show grew, Dan found other ways to release his energy. He starred in a few movies, including Come Blow Your Horn with Frank Sinatra, and even helped start a series on Host to promote the business by appearing in commercials and visiting franchises in person. It was a smart move that showed how much he loved his role on Bonanza. The show wasn't afraid to deal with important issues, even if Pernell didn't always think it went far enough. Dan was featured in the Declaration of Independence. He spoke at the convention and said, for example, Enter Thomas Bowers dealt with racism in a way that was new for the time. In that story, Haas helps protect an African-American opera singer from racism in Virginia City was a strong episode that showed the Cartwrights standing up for what's right. Other episodes, like The Fear, Murch, and The Wish, also dealt with racism and inequality, slowly pushing the limits of what a Western could do. But Pernell thought the show could have done more. He wanted deeper stories with stronger messages. By 1965, he'd had enough. He finished his 6-year contract and quit the show, leaving behind one of the most popular TV shows of all time. His character Adam was written out. While later episodes occasionally mentioned Adam, Pernell never came back. Dan, on the other hand, stayed with Bonanza until his untimely death in 1972. He was a cornerstone of the show, adding warmth and humor to every episode, and fans loved how Dan played him. Pernell and Dan may have had different experiences on Bonanza, but they both contributed to its success in their own ways. The show became a cultural touchstone not just for its entertainment. The Cartwright brothers were the best of what people could be, whether it was Adam's intelligence or Haas's big heart. But their relationship was complicated, as was much of their time on Bonanza. When Dan died in 1972, it shocked everyone, including Pernell. What happened after Dan's death raised questions that fans still ask today, like why didn't Pernell Roberts go to Dan Blocker's funeral? Dan Blocker was only 43 years old when he died suddenly of a pulmonary embolism after his death. His death shocked Hollywood and left the cast of Bonanza heartbroken. Dan was the heart of the show both on and off screen. He brought humor, kindness, and a unique warmth that made him a fan favorite. Off-screen, Dan was known for being humble and avoiding the spotlight. He loved acting but hated the attention it brought him. To get away from it all, he moved his family to Switzerland in 1970 and settled in the beautiful lake country he had fallen in love with. Dan's move to Switzerland said a lot about the kind of person he was. He wanted his family to have a quiet life away from the chaos of Hollywood. He once said he felt guilty about how easy his career had been compared to other actors' struggles. Despite his fame, Dan stayed humble. He didn't care about the glitz and glamour. He cared about his family and the values he believed in. That humility made his death even harder for those who knew him. It wasn't just the fame. When the news of Dan's death spread, the cast and crew of Bonanza were devastated. Michael Landon, who played Little Joe, was especially upset. He later said that whenever he needed to cry during a scene, he would think about Dan's death. The producers did something that had never been done before on TV. They addressed Haas's absence by mentioning his death. It was the first time this had ever been done. The story didn't go as planned. It wasn't clear what happened, but it was clear that Haas was dead, and the Cartwright family was sad. It was a brave move that showed how much Dan meant to the show. Pernell Roberts, on the other hand, wasn't at Dan's funeral. For years, people have wondered why he wasn't there. Some think it was because of Pernell's complicated relationship with Bonanza. He quit the show in 1965, unhappy with what he saw as its lack of depth and originality. It wasn't an easy decision, but Pernell was firm in his decision. His belief that he needed to move on caused problems in his relationships with the cast. He stayed friendly with some, but there was always a sense of distance. Another reason people think Pernell might not have been there is because of his personality. He was a very private man, a lot like Dan, who avoided showing emotion in public and didn't like being the center of attention. It's possible that all the attention from Dan's funeral was too much for him, and he may have felt that it was more appropriate for him to grieve in his own way, away from the cameras and reporters. Pernell also had a complicated relationship with grief. He was known for being reflective and even brooding at times. After his Bonanza co-stars had died, he joked about being Pernell the last one Roberts, recognizing the strange reality of outliving them all. Now, his sense of humor was dark, but it showed a man who carried the weight of those losses in his own way. Years later, Pernell spoke warmly of Dan Blocker. He described him as, "People couldn't help but like Dan. Even though they weren't close, Pernell clearly respected Dan and valued the time they spent working together." His absence at the funeral wasn't because he didn't care. It was probably because he was having trouble figuring out how to say goodbye. But he came to work every day and was satisfied with his work. Dan's funeral itself was the subject of rumors, including the strange claim that he was buried in a piano box because he was so tall. This story, while untrue, shows how larger-than-life Dan seemed to his fans. He was buried in a simple family plot in Texas with his parents and sister. It was a quiet, respectful funeral for a man who had always liked to stay out of the spotlight. Dan Blocker's death was the start of the end for Bonanza. The show had a hard time getting back on track without him, and its 14th and final season was its least popular. Fans and cast alike missed him. Michael Landon later said that losing Dan was like losing the show's soul. It was never the same without him. Pernell Roberts went on to be successful in other projects, even though he started a new part of his career after playing Trapper John Maryland in the late 1970s. Bonanza would always be a big part of his legacy. He may have had problems with the show, but he couldn't escape its effects, or the bond he shared with his co-stars, especially Dan Blocker. Even now, decades later, their performances still remind us of the magic they brought to the Ponderosa Ranch, and maybe that's the best way to honor them, remembering the joy they gave us and the legacy they left behind.